New measures the government says are intended to prevent steel dumping in Canada have now become law. The legislation announced earlier this month was ushered quickly through the House and Senate before Parliament rose for summer last week. It would allow the government to impose quotas on foreign steel imports if they surge above a certain level, though that level has yet to be defined specifically. The government has never used this tool in this capacity before, and not everyone is happy about the new measure. Jesse Goldman is an international trade lawyer with BLG Law. He represents construction companies who say they're suffering from high steel prices. And Mr. Goldman joins us now from Toronto. Hi there, nice to see you again.
Hi there, thanks for inviting me.
So the last time we were talking about this, it was just proposed legislation. You were speaking about some of the nerves your clients had around the bill. Now that it's passed, what are you hearing?
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace and a lot of nervousness about when these cases may be brought, how they're going to be administered, whether there are going to be quotas on steel, whether there are going to be surtaxes, and the timing for these measures relative to existing and future contracts and projects. So a lot of people are out there trying to get answers. The answers so far are few and far between. I would say that the legislative changes are sort of ahead of the policy at this point. So there are a few more chapters to be written. We hope to get more answers in the days to come. From my client's perspective, consulting with the government has been a bit of a frustrating process in recent weeks. The government has been very eager to hear from the Canadian steel producers, but less eager to hear from importers and users of foreign steel. So we're still trying to get answers, but there's a lot of concern out there in the marketplace and a chill going through the market, certainly for users of foreign steel.
I want to ask about that chill, but just to delve a little bit into some of the questions that exist out there. The government, of course, maintains that this is just a measure that should a surge occur, they would be able to use. Why do your clients still have clients about that? Is it because, for example, that surge hasn't been defined? What is it?
Well, I think, yeah, the surge hasn't been defined. I think if we hearken back to the first time that the provisional measures were used, the government prepared a report, and the report was an internal report prepared for the Minister of Finance. It was shared with the Governor and Council, or Cabinet, in other words, and formed the basis for the 200-day provisional safeguards that started in October 2018. That report was sought by Canada's trading partners at the WTO. The government refused to provide that to Canada's trading partners. It also refused to provide it to the public. So we don't know what criteria the government is going to use for a surge. For example, what period they're going to look at. Are they going to look at a quarter or 2 quarters or a few weeks? Nobody really knows. So there are a lot of questions about what the criteria may be. And then, in terms of the use of the measure itself, we're already hearing that the Canadian Steel Producers Association are effectively shopping a number of potential cases to the government. So this
doesn't mean the government will bite, though, to be fair.
Doesn't necessarily mean the government's going to bite, but I think, as I said the last time, I don't think you buy a shiny new tool and then admire it. Clearly, the Canadian steel producers, who have been quite successful conveying their views and getting the government to act on their behalf, would like the government to bring cases and bring cases as quickly as possible. I read the testimony that was given by the Canadian Steel Producers Association representative, both to the House of Commons Committee and the Senate Committee, and they made the point that the information more recently, in their view, demonstrates a surge, and they would like the government to use the measure as quickly as possible.
Have they given you, has the government given you or your clients any sort of indication about when they might define that criteria? And I ask because when I've spoken to them on background, they were pretty clear that the levels would be set at, they used the analogy of the quotas when it came to autos, that they'd be set so high that would trigger a surge, the definition of a surge would be triggered only when the levels are so high that it would still allow for growth and that wouldn't, cripple you're in the industry that you represent. What kind of things are you hearing? Have you been given a timeline as to when you'll get those details?
Haven't heard anything. Communication with government on this file by the parts of the steel industry that are not steel producers has been lacking, in our view. We've made a number of efforts to communicate with government, to get meetings with them, to get additional information. We've largely been met with silence and delay. So the answer to your question is there's really no information that's being shared with this part of the steel industry. I'm sure the Canadian steel producers have considerably more information. And then in terms of the levels they're going to set, it would be encouraging if they were to set levels that were considerably higher than historical usage. That wasn't the case in October 2018. The levels that were set were based on historical usage and recent historical usage, and as a result caused all sorts of distortions in the marketplace. So if they go with historical levels over a period of time, whether it's a year or 2 years or 3 years, that is not going to be encouraging, because it certainly doesn't accommodate the prospect for growth in consumption and the need to use more imported steel as a consequence.
Last time I spoke with you, I remember that we sort of touched on the idea of the U.S. and specifically the Trump administration talking about these kinds of measures and this kind of idea of dumping and that sort of thing. Last week, when the Prime Minister visited the President appeared pleased about this type of thing. Is there not kind of something to that? Do you I guess sympathize or understand the motivation, in part at least, if that's the case?
I certainly understand. Sympathize might be a bit of a stretch. I understand. Look, I think a couple of things are important. Safeguard measures don't have anything to do with dumping. In fact, safeguard measures are targeted at fairly traded imports. There's no allegation that the goods are being dumped into the Canadian market. Canadian steel producers haven't and can't say that, nor can the government. In terms of the response of the Trump administration and Canada's multi-pronged efforts to appease the Trump administration, this certainly fits a pattern. I think the complaints from the Trump administration about Canada and Canadian steel have been oblique and a little bit hard to follow. I think what the government is trying to do is effectively trying to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and to see what sticks and what pleases the Trump administration. And unfortunately, I'm not so sure that it's any more sophisticated than that. This particular legislative change, which repeals the domestic adoption of Canada's international treaty obligations, is particularly problematic, and as I said last time, will not be challenged simply by virtue of having affected the legislation, but if it is used, will almost certainly and instantly be challenged, and even more importantly than being challenged at the WTO, which can be a slow and laborious process, will result in trade retaliation against Canada, just as Canada retaliated against the U.S. 232 measures. So those Canadian retaliatory measures were not WTO compliant. Canada did them anyway in an effort to protect its domestic industry or industries, and we would expect that other countries would do the same against Canada.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Mr. Goldman.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We reached out to the Canadian Steel Producers Association to get their take on this new law. They told us, in part, this legislation provides an important tool to the federal government to take swift action should imports from foreign countries surge and threaten our domestic industry and our workers. Safeguards do not prevent imports but manage them to historical levels. In these unprecedented times, we must update all aspects of our trade regime, the statement goes on to say, to protect Canada from disruptive trade practices. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.